Good evening. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the City of Kettering Planning Commission for February 7th, 2022. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Miami Valley Cable Council for televising and taping tonight's meeting for rebroadcast on Channel 6 and streaming live over the internet at mvcc.net. It will also be recorded and available later for viewing on mvcc.net. Since this meeting is both audio and video taped to form a complete record for possible appeal to City Council and/or the courts, it is important that anyone who wishes to address the Commission will need to come to the lectern to speak into the microphone and give their name and address for the record. Planning Commission is a volunteer independent body appointed by Council whose mission is to hear all bodies involved and subsequently make a motion to approve, deny, continue, or recommend the application. All action by the Commission can be appealed to the City Council. This time I'd like to introduce the Commission. On my far left is Ken Lackey, Assistant Secretary. Next to him is Carol Fisher, our Secretary. On my immediate left is Connie Gaw, our Recording Secretary. My name is Don Shimon. I'm the current chair. On my right is Ray Waskey, the Vice Chair, and on the far right is Commissioner Don Rethman. For staff tonight is David Roller, City Planner. And moving on to the first item on the agenda, approval of the minutes from January 3rd, 2022. Any comments on the minutes? No. Can we get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Lackey?
Yes.
Mr. Rethman?
Yes.
Mr. Waskey?
Abstain.
And Mr. Shimon?
Yes. All right, moving on to the second item on our agenda, new business, to amend various sections of the Kettering Zoning Code, PC-22-001. And this is a public hearing. I assume for the city is Mr. Roller.
Thank you, Mr. Shimon. Throughout the year, we monitor the zoning code to find errors, items that may be confusing, or that may produce results that are not as we intended. At the end of the year, we usually collect all those things and we put them together into a proposal, and that's what we have tonight. We have a collection of those errors, things that were confusing and things that weren't producing the results that we wanted in this proposal. Most of the areas that we are covering are not groundbreaking or much of a departure from stuff that we're already doing. These are mostly just small items that help us remove confusion or fix things that are broken. So be happy to answer any questions that you have as we go through the presentation. Feel free to interrupt and stop me if you need anything. But it'll probably just take a couple minutes. We'll go through these item by item, if that's all right with you.
Works for us.
Okay. These are in the order of appearance within the zoning code. So starting with Chapter 1135, that's our zoning districts chapter. We have a very simple item here. In the permitted use table, salvage yards appears. It should have been struck the last time we had a proposal before the Planning Commission. We did take salvage yards out of the permitted uses in other sections of the code, but it did not get removed from the permitted use table, so this would clean that up for us. Moving to Chapter 1139, that's our accessory structures chapter. That's 1139.039, decks and patios. In this particular area, we've been permitting patios as porches, and that's not correct. That's something that we didn't look at close enough over the past few years, but porches are actually defined in our code as a roofed structure, and those have a certain way that they're permitted and they're supposed to be designed. But we've been allowing people to do patios as well in the front yard. It's a normal thing. It's not anything odd at all, except our code doesn't allow it currently. So this basically allows that to occur. There is a standard in there that attempts to keep people from parking on the patio, which has been known to happen from time to time, and this would help us make sure that that doesn't happen. Moving forward to Chapter 1145, Parking and Loading. The first thing that we have here in this chapter, there's some confusion between what constitutes a parking space, what is a driveway, and how do those two things relate to each other. This removes that confusion while still attempting to accomplish what our intent is, and that is to not have front yards paved fully to turn into parking lots. That's how we've been enforcing it, but when people ask about this particular code section, it gets confusing. We generally have to explain this a lot at the front counter to different residents as they're trying to expand their driveways and do different things. This gets a little bit confusing, so this reaffirms what the original intent is and removes that confusion. The second thing that's here is we have a reduction in the amount of required parking spaces that are needed for residential uses. Currently, our code requires 2 parking spaces for single-unit dwellings and 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit for multi-unit dwellings. When we were reviewing these standards, we felt like requiring more than 1 space, one for the apartment-type complexes. Very seldom do we have anybody that wants to build that many parking spaces. They don't want to build that many because the market tells them that they don't need that. So we're just requiring too much parking in that regard. In the single-unit dwellings, we felt that requiring 2 off-street parking spaces was a bit much, considering that we're trying to encourage better, efficient land use and also remove barriers to equitable housing. And quite frankly, people will park in their driveways even though they're not considered parking spaces. So it basically accomplishes the same thing as before, but it reduces that true minimum, takes it down a little bit. In Chapter 1147, we have an addition to our fence material requirement. For chain link fences, we're requiring that those be installed with a protective coating. That's a pretty common thing to find now, but it definitely reduces that long-term maintenance, prevents the rusting and the wearing out of those chain link fences. Here, the next thing we have in that chapter is basins. We've had a couple of projects come in where they've attempted to put the detention basin in the buffer yard and then plant the slope of that basin with the buffer yard materials. And while it's considered to be not a good practice from an engineering standpoint, we don't have anything in the code that prevents that. So it just becomes a long-term maintenance issue. The soil can erode, the basin then starts to fill up with soil and silt. The leaves fall into the basin, they clog the basin starts to fail. So this basically follows engineering best practices. Furthermore, in the landscaping and buffer yards chapter, we have a provision that we're introducing for telecommunications for the fiber optic boxes. We're starting to see some of the fiber optic folks come into the South Dayton region. As they do that, they have equipment that they want to install. Some of that equipment may make its way onto private property. This would ensure that we have some protections for screening and to trying to conceal those items of equipment if they do happen to be located on a private residence property.
Dave, I had one question for you. I know our neighbors behind us have AT&T boxes that have been there forever, and they're not screened or anything like that. Has that been grandfathered in, or?
Yeah, this would only apply to anything new.
Okay.
So anything that's currently in existence would not fall into that unless that was modified somehow or moved, or
right.
Then this would be applicable.
Okay, thank you.
The plant material specifications, we had it was a little bit wordy in the table, so this made it a little bit more concise, shortened up the table. Then we have another one. This says basins, but it shouldn't say basins. The heading for this should say plant diversity. This would be a new section within the code. In light of recent pest problems to some of our landscaping areas, this has come to our attention as something that we might want to have. In the late 80s, 90s, planting ash trees was a very popular choice in town. So we have a lot of development that was planted with ash trees. It was seen as a wonderful street tree. It was cold, salt tolerant, dropped little leaves, so it was easy to clean up and didn't clog storm sewers. All of those trees out, similar to when the Dutch elm disease came through and took away all the street trees around the country. So the plant diversity requirements basically says you can't have too much of any one thing. Depending on the amount of plants that you're planting, we want you to plant a few different species so that we can prevent that from happening in the future. Chapter 1149, architecture, we have a provision in there that says the minimum clearance height needs to be 9 feet for balconies, arcades, and different things like that. This reduces it down to 8 feet, which is probably more of a true minimum than the 9 feet was. In Chapter 1151, signs, we have a provision for ground signs. Recently, we revised our industrial zoning district to be the business park district. We changed the name and we expanded some of the uses to better reflect how the research park, how the Kettering Business Park were being used or desired to be used. One thing we didn't change, though, was the sign provisions for business park. They still kind of reflected that old school, concept that industrial sites didn't need a lot of signage, and all they would ever get is a little sign that said, shipping, receiving with some arrows. That's not really how these folks want to be. They want to have some brand identity. They want to be able to have more of a presence and have some visibility as well. So this reflects that as well without giving too much signage to some of our smaller business park sites. The next item here under the signage chapter is temporary wall banners and window signs. Currently, the table for that, it's intended to allow wall banners within those districts for residential purposes. However, that was left off of the table, even though the code section before it says that it's permitted. So that adds that back in to make sure that that's clear. The second thing is that those things were always intended to be reviewed in aggregate. The total square footage of signage for all wall banners, for all window signs, not just per window sign, per banner. So this clarifies that and allows us to enforce that as originally intended. Finally, we have in that section, and this is probably the biggest code change that we're proposing, and that's for campus and large site signage. Just to give you an idea of what that or who this would apply to in town. Examples of that would be the hospital, Kettering Business Park, Miami Valley Research Park, the Rec Center complex, as well as Fairmont High School. They would also fall into that as well. So campus and large site signage, what we have there we're basically making a wholesale revision to that table that you saw in that chapter. That was a very confusing way of allowing signage for some of our taller buildings in that district, which happened to be Kettering Hospital. That was kind of a set of standards that was drawn around what they had rather than reflecting how we would like to enforce those standards. So this really simplifies that. It makes more of something that can be manageable for us to enforce. It also allows them to change over time, which the previous set of standards did not really allow. This allows us also to apply these to other developments as they come online, rather than just being narrowly tailored to the hospital's needs. It also adds the ability to create some gateway features if desired, which has been brought to our attention for the research park as well as business park. So this kind of helps those folks take advantage of this.
I have some questions on that.
Sure.
So under the first one, building signs, it says conditions for additional signs, and it says no conditions and number of signs permitted. It says no maximum, but then you go down to the next sort of section, and it talks then about an additional building sign. So that was confusing to me.
Okay, let me take a look at that.
115104.14.
I think my printer ran out of paper when it got to that page, so I don't have that. Mine
Okay.
stops here at,
You want this?
yeah, can I borrow that for a second?
You can take it. Go ahead and, go ahead and take it with you. I'll just listen.
Thank you, Connie. Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Rethman, could you restate that?
Yeah, so under sort of the top of that table there, it talks about building signs, and then it talks about conditions for additional signs, says no conditions, and also says, a number of signs permitted, it says no maximum. Then you go down to the next sort of section, and it's talking about an additional building sign is permitted, provided when conditions be satisfied. So am I missing something? It seems like it says there is no maximum, but then we're permitting an additional sign, so I don't know, are we missing a section in there?
As the way that this would be read is that you start across on the left-hand side, and then you would work your way across the table. It might be helpful for us to put maybe a line through there to help make that more readable.
Okay.
We could certainly do that, but the way it would read is that left to right would be building signs. There's no conditions for an additional sign because we're just talking about building signs. There's not a maximum number. There is a sign area permitted, a maximum. It's a calculation based on the linear frontage of the building, with no single sign to exceed 2/3 of not to exceed 50% of the total allowable area. No requirement for display height. The required design elements or how that's constructed is there. It talks about individual letters on the facade.
Mm-hmm.
So then you go down to the next one. An additional building sign is permitted provided condition can be satisfied. The condition is that the building that it's going to go on would be greater than 4 stories and 30,000 square feet of gross floor area. You get one of those per campus or large site. And then the maximum copy height would be 10 feet, and the length of it cannot exceed 30% of the building frontage on which the sign to be located. So the way to think about that would be, let's say you're at Miami Valley Hospital downtown. They have signs all around campus, and each building has a sign. But at the very top of the tower, it says, Premier Health or Miami Valley Hospital, whatever it says at the very top. That's what this is encapsulating, is that if you have, or over at Fairmont High School, maybe they have something that they put on the Trent Arena. Or at the Research Park, if somebody wants to build a larger office building there, they would be able to put something on that one building that's kind of more of an identity for the whole thing that's on the building. In this particular case, Kettering Hospital is looking to locate a Kettering Health Network sign on the cancer center that doesn't fit any of the other stuff for the building signage. But instead of giving them that ability to have that on every building, this basically says you get one of those per campus.
Okay.
So that's the intent of what's going on there.
So I think you clarified this one we were talking about on the line above when we were talking about building frontage. So that's fronting on any road, on the primary street? I know from my professional life that obviously, signage sometimes, if you were on a corner, then you would count both as being frontage. And then, question is then, does this major sign need to be on the facade facing that frontage? Or in the case of, something out at the Miami Valley Research Park, if it's their street address frontages might be one thing, but a more highly traveled road might be on a different one. Are those linked? We don't care?
Basically, what this says is that you're allowed to put a sign basically on any side of a building that you want,
Okay.
but the calculation is going to be based on on where you put the building.
Okay.
Where you put the sign on the building. In this particular case, most people are probably not going to put a sign on the back of their building, but we do see that from time to time. You might have an outlot building, like or you have like a Chick-fil-A, and you want people to see your sign from the shopping center. So you might put a sign on the back of the building. So there are some some things that would, we don't necessarily always want to limit what people do or where they put their signs. The more it tends to be that the more we try to circle around it and focus in on it, then as soon as you do that, you get two people that want to do it differently, and it makes sense. So usually we just kind of let, rational thought usually rules out on that.
Okay, thank you.
Did anyone else have any questions on that particular code section? And finally, in the signage chapter, we have prohibited locations. Currently, we do not allow folks to put a sign on the slope of a roof. We've been enforcing that since, maybe 30, 40 years we've been doing it that way. We also don't allow them to place it on awnings or basically any slope of a roof. This clarifies that by making sure that it says the slope of any roof, whether it's applied or mansard or whatever it may be. This clarifies that so that it falls in line with how we've been enforcing that. Chapter 1153, Procedures and Enforcement. We have not had a clearly defined process for processing conditional use amendments. We've taken them through the regular process, but it's actually not listed in the code. It doesn't say that we're supposed to do that. It just says what constitutes a significant or a major change or some other things like that, but it doesn't actually give us a process to use. So this makes certain of that so that it's not just ambiguous. But it falls in line with how we have been doing it. Chapter 1159, this is the final set of stuff here. We have revisions to 3 different definitions. The first is dwelling unit. Right now, we do not allow in the code short-term rentals. That would be things like Airbnbs, VRBO, that type stuff. The dwelling units are intended to be permanent, which is at least one 30-day period. So such as like a month-to-month lease would be permitted, but we would not allow somebody to rent their house out on a nightly rate. We do understand that people do that. It's difficult for us to find them and enforce that, but this reiterates what is currently the rules, removes that confusion. Right now it says that it's meant for permanent occupancy, but this clarifies what that means.
Dave, I want to follow up on that. I remember we had a case a couple of years back where Airbnb. How do other cities handle that?
Some disallow, some don't regulate them at all. And some communities such as like Yellow Springs and Columbus, they allow them, but they have restrictions for them. And then they basically have established a tax. So you get a permit or permission somehow to do it, and then you pay a tax and a fee per year to have that.
So they basically set up a licensing process?
Yeah, basically.
Something like that? Okay.
All of those things are fine. There's not really any, it depends on the community that you have, the type of housing that you have. A place like Yellow Springs certainly can benefit from having some Airbnbs. They are somewhat of a tourist destination that doesn't have a lot of hotels or anywhere to stay. So they do benefit from that. It provides that service, and then it provides the city with some revenue. City of Columbus, what they do with their taxes and fees that they collect is they put those into a housing fund. That fund is then used to provide for low-income housing credits and different things like that to encourage different housing opportunities within the city. So every community is different. The way people want to address that is there's lots of different ways to do it. Currently, what the rules that we have is that it's not permitted, and this is a recommendation from some folks that clarifies that and removes that confusion that a dwelling unit is intended to be permanently occupied.
Okay, so by us not permitting it, we're not the Lone Ranger out there just being the only ones out not permitting that.
No, and certainly if this is something that we think is important to address, or we certainly could change that in the future. This isn't something that, we are firmly set in stone on or anything. This is just happens to be what we have, and we're just trying to make sure that it's clearly written as it is.
Yeah, I don't see it as being a major issue, at least at this time, but, okay, thank you.
No, you're very welcome. Principal facades, the current language right now creates a really overly broad interpretation of what can constitute a principal facade. It really overreached. We didn't intend it to do that when we haven't enforced it that way. But it was pointed out to us during a review that it could be much bigger than what we're doing. So we wanted to dial that back down, and so it was really only going to do what we wanted it to do. So we changed a little bit of language in there, and it really, it does do how we've been enforcing it now. Parking islands and peninsulas, right now we don't have a definition for what those are. We did have a project that came through, and they proposed to do some parking lot islands and some peninsulas that were absolutely ridiculous, that did not meet any intention for what those would be. We were able to talk them out of pursuing that. We said we wouldn't approve it, and if they wanted to appeal it, they could. They chose to just go along with the standard practice, but that did make us realize that that was something we needed a definition for, to prevent something silly like that from happening in the future. So this clears up that mess for us. That's the end of all of the proposed revisions. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, any further questions for Mr. Roller or Mr. Lackey?
No, I don't have anything.
Ms.
I
Fisher?
don't either.
Mr. Waskey?
No.
Mr. Ruthman?
Nope.
I have none myself, and since the city is the applicant, we don't have to hear from the applicant at this point, so that leaves us next with audience participation. This is a public hearing. If there is anyone in the audience who would like to come down and ask any questions at this time, this would be the time. Seeing none, we will move on. Staff recommendation.
We did review the proposal in against our intent and goals of the City of Kettering zoning code. We found that it met those statements of intent and the goals of our zoning code. We've provided that review summary in the packet. It's quite lengthy, so I'm not going to go over it right now, but we did review it against those, and we found that it met those standards. We are recommending approval based on the evidence as presented this evening and the analysis and findings made within our staff report.
All right, any final commission comments or discussion? All right, seeing none, and since this was a public hearing, can we get a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved?
Second?
All right, we have motion and a second. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Waskey,
Yes.
Mr. Rathman,
Yes.
Mrs. Fisher,
Yes.
Mr. Lackey,
Yes.
Mr. Shemin.
Yes. All right, I believe, Ms. Fisher, you have a motion for us?
I do. We have a zoning code update, a zoning code text amendment. Whereas an application has been received from Thomas Robillard, Director of Planning and Development, the City of Kettering, Ohio, requesting approval of zoning code text amendments to amend selected portions of the City of Kettering zoning code. And whereas the Planning Commission has reviewed the facts surrounding this request, including an oral and written report by city staff, which is incorporated herein, and held a hearing on February 7th, 2022. And whereas this request constitutes approval of a recommendation to Kettering City Council to amend the selected portions of the City of Kettering zoning code as presented by staff within their staff report and oral presentation. And whereas the Planning Commission adopts the findings of fact presented by staff in their staff report, which is incorporated into this motion, I move that the applicant's request for a recommendation to City Council for approval of zoning code text amendments to the City of Kettering zoning code be approved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Woski?
Yes.
Mr. Rathman?
Yes.
Mr. Lackey?
Yes.
Mr. Shimon?
Yes. Next item on the addenda, it's been a rough night. Next item on the agenda is audience participation, and this is for items that are not on the agenda. So if there's anyone in the audience that would like to speak to us about anything, this would be that time. And once again, seeing none, other business, signing of plats,
We do not have any plats to sign this evening.
communications and reports.
None at this time.
Planning Commission comments, Mr. Lackey,
I don't have anything tonight.
Ms. Fisher,
Nothing.
Mr. Woski,
I have nothing.
Mr. Rethman.
Nothing?
I have nothing myself, so that being the case, this meeting will be adjourned at 7:33 PM until our next regularly scheduled meeting.